We're pleased to have Daniel May here today from Franklin, Tennessee, all thanks to Ashley Aarons that we've talked about earlier, her telling us about him. He's our speaker and promises to come to our show this next year. His presentation today is titled Laura Corrigan, Shunned American Socialite. So take it away, Daniel, and tell us about Laura, please.
Thank you so much, Alan. Thank you for inviting me to present today. There is literally an entire side to postcard collecting that most collectors ignore. Excuse me, and I'm talking about the back of postcards. I love the fronts of postcards just as much as everyone else, but I think the backs have so many stories to tell that most collectors just ignore. And I hope that after this presentation, maybe you'll feel the urge to look at the backs of some of your own postcards and see what messages are written on them. So I'm going to tell the story of Laura May Corrigan, and I'm going to use her own words written on the backs of postcards. I was also able to connect with a distant relatives of Laura's for this presentation, and they were able to fill me in on many details about her life that I had no idea of. So who is Laura Corrigan? Laura May Corrigan was born Laura May Whitrock in 1879, and she became known for helping Allied troops and refugees during World War II and received several awards and medals for doing so. She has been described as an author, a poet, and a philanthropist. She's on the left in this image. She's the younger woman there standing up. And you can see the woman on the right's name is on the top at the bottom, but we haven't been able to identify her or find much about her family history, but I at least know that it's not her mother. She was born in Stevens Point, Wisconsin to Emma Sitherwood and Charles Whitrock. Laura was their first child. She was born in 1879, and I put Stevens Point right there on the map. It's not a small town in Wisconsin, right in the middle of the state. It's a nice little medium-sized town. Her father, Charles, actually committed suicide in 1881. And when I read an article written about his death, he was said to have suffered from insanity at brief intervals. And when I read more about him, it seems like he was presenting symptoms of what we would call today as bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. And unfortunately, back then, they just didn't have the same knowledge and treatment for mental illness as they do today. Obviously, if you've ever seen any insane asylum postcards or insane hospitals, you'll know that they really didn't know what to do with people that were suffering from mental illness, unfortunately. And like I said, he died just 2 years after Laura was born. Her mother remarried to a William Parker, also of Stevens Point, and Laura had three half-sisters from that relationship, Grace, Vita, and Vera, and we'll actually see Laura talking more about her half-sisters in the postcards that she's writing back home. Laura also had an older sister or half-sister out of wedlock, and her name was Clara. Laura attended school in Stevens Point from first grade into normal school, and the normal school in Stevens Point is now the University of Wisconsin at Stevens Point. So from the beginning, Laura had more ambition than just a quiet life in Stevens Point. She didn't like to tell people where she was from, and she even changed the spelling of her last name to try to hide her identity. So I'm sure some of you now live in smaller towns where there's a few prominent families in town, and if you have a certain last name, you have assumptions about that person and know where they come from and what their family members are like. So that was the case for Laura. She was unfortunately ashamed of where she came from, and that's why she changed her last name from Whitrock to Whitlock. And upon the marriage to her first husband, she became Laura McMartin, and upon the marriage to her second husband, James, she became Laura Corrigan. And she also became wealthy upon her marriage to James, and she's most commonly known as Laura Corrigan now. She worked as a waitress and may have also worked as a telephone operator and a cigar store clerk before she landed a job as an editor of High School Life out of Chicago. And that's not about high school. It's actually a newspaper, or sorry, a magazine that covered high society at the time. And getting that job in 1907 was really where Laura began to realize her dreams of becoming more well-known and more connected to the wealthy in society. So one of her assignments was to travel to Cleveland and interview James Corgan Sr., who was a steel magnate. He was one of the owners of Corrigan McKinney Steel, and they apparently became friends, or at least stayed in touch after the interview, because Laura would later travel to Cleveland for James Sr.'s funeral in 1908, and that's where she met her, who would become her second husband, James Jr. And like I said, that was her second marriage to the heir of the steel fortune, James Corgan Jr., or Jimmy, and they were very, very wealthy. So she had a reputation for lavish parties, but many other wealthy women of the time looked down on her in the Cleveland area because she did come from a poorer background. Back then, it was much more familial wealth and generational wealth, and she was also once divorced, and that caused her to be shunned and outcast by the wealthy society at that time. But she spent a lot of time in Europe, and they became much more well known and well liked in Europe. There's so much that's been written about her time in Europe. She actually became friends with Prince George. She was known for standing on her heads at parties. That was her party trick. And she started a rumor that Prince George would be coming to one of her parties, which was completely made up. But Prince George heard the rumor and decided to show up and made her dream a reality. And that's how they connected to the royal family. So after that, she and her husband, Jimmy, also attended the Epsom Derby with Queen Mary, who was the Queen of England at the time. And she owned a very luxurious apartment in Paris at the Ritz. Before the World War II occupation, she actually lent the use of that apartment to Winston Churchill. And during the occupation, her apartment was seized by Reich Marshal Goring of Germany. And then after the occupation, she offered the use of the apartment to General Eisenhower, but was declined. So obviously a very nice space to live if you have all those famous people that are using your apartment. And in an article that was later written about James's death, it said that in 1 year, Laura reputedly spent $5 million for social achievement. So these are things like hosting parties, events, and social engagement. So it was clearly what she wanted. She didn't spend money on possessions or cars or anything like that. What she wanted was to be wealthy and famous and well known and well liked. And she spent so much money to accomplish that goal. Even though Laura was extremely wealthy and had what almost anyone would consider an amazing life, it did have a lot of tragedies. Her first husband, Duncan McMartin, passed away in 1919. He died of a stroke at age 57 in the bathtub of a Chicago hotel. And this image shows who I believe to be her first husband at her and James's home in Cleveland. You might think that's a little strange that her first husband is at her and her second husband's home, but they appeared to remain friendly after the divorce, and there are records of them performing together at certain events, which I'll talk about later. But this man to me looks like her first husband. And you can see their home there in the background, which I'll show another postcard of later. This home was called Nagarock, which is just Corrigan spelled backwards. They really like the creative naming of their home, and it's a rhododendron bush in their front yard at their home in Cleveland. So this image shows her second husband, Jimmy, which you can tell is not the same man in the first picture. The couple attended a party by Jimmy Corgan in 1913, and after that, she became his mistress before they divorced, her and Duncan McMartin, her first husband, the next year. And her, Jimmy, and her first husband also performed together at a vaudeville and burlesque benefit show in Morrisburg, Ontario, together that same year. So it appears that even though the marriage didn't work out, they remained friendly together. And here's another picture of her first husband, Dr. Duncan McMartin. Her second husband, James, did pass away early as well. He passed away in 1928 at the age of 47. And she had two half-sisters, Vera and Vida. Vera passed away as an infant, and Vida died in her early 20s. This is the back of that postcard that I showed you earlier of their home in Cleveland and the rhododendron bush. She wrote on this to her aunt, and Laura wrote, "This is a rhododendron in my yard. I hope you are very much improved in health. Vida is here and looking fine. Love, Laura C." And I thought that postcard was notable because Laura's talking about the health of her half-sister Vida. So she sent this in 1917 when Vida was visiting her, and Vida was just in her 20s, but she would go on to pass away just 2 years later in 1919. So I'm not sure what illness she had, but it seems like it lasted at least several years. And Laura herself would pass away after a very accomplished life in 1948 of cancer at age 69 while she was visiting her sister in New York City. I learned something when I acquired this postcard collection, which is that if you were wealthy and famous enough at the time, you could have postcards commissioned and printed of your own homes. So unlike postcards that you would pick up at a drugstore or the five and dime shop, these postcards were what wealthy people used as stationery and to send to their friends. And this is one that Laura used. This is the residence of Mr. Jimmy Corrigan, 8114 Euclid Avenue, Cleveland, Ohio. This is different than the first home I showed you. This home is unfortunately not standing anymore. I looked at the address and it looks like now it is a restaurant and parking lot, unfortunately. And here is a printed postcard of the home I showed you earlier. This is what they called Nagy Rock, which is just Corrigan spelled backwards. And this home and their other home was around Euclid Avenue in Cleveland, Ohio. Cleveland obviously is still a major city, but it was completely different back in the day, which I had no idea of until I was researching Laura's life. 58 of the top 63 wealthiest families in the US had a home in Cleveland, and of those, many of them had homes on Euclid Avenue. So it's just really completely different from how we look at and how Cleveland is today. And this is another picture postcard that was produced of their home. And this is the garden at Naga Rock. And I just think this is so amazing because it looks like a professionally manicured and well-kept garden, something that you would go and visit and maybe pay an admissions fee for, not something that you would see at someone's house, especially back then. But you can see the fountains there in the middle and just the beautiful, beautiful flowers and hedges and trees there. This is the back of that postcard. So actually, that home, Nagy Rock, that I just showed you is in Wickliffe, Cleveland, and is now the Pine Ridge Country Club. When I was looking that up, I believe the home has been modified, but the building is still standing and it's actually still in use today. So this is the back of the postcard of their garden. And I thought the message on this one was really notable too. Laura wrote to her aunt, "Thanks for your letter. Mother is here and feeling well, or sorry, mother is better, and I have purchased a lovely new house for her and am furnishing it all new. She has a trained nurse and housekeeper. Hope you are very well. Love, Laura." And I picked this message to show because I thought it was really emblematic of the times and what you could do if you had money back then. Laura didn't come from money, obviously, and her mother didn't have money to buy herself a new house and furnish it all new and everything, but Laura did, and she used it to help out her mother, buying her a new home, furnishing it all new, hiring a trained nurse and a housekeeper. And talking with a distant relative to Laura, one thing that I had learned, even though they weren't direct descendants, they still had stories in the family of how generous Laura was. She was known to give away fur coats and just be very generous with her wealth to her family that did not come from wealth. So even though at the beginning she kind of acted like she was ashamed of her family name and where she came from, she really helped them out a lot when she became wealthy. And another reason why this message was notable is if she was hiring a trained nurse for her mother, I would assume she was in poor health and may not live much longer, but her mother would actually go on to live another 16 years and pass away in 1933 at the age of 76. Here is their home that I mentioned a little bit earlier, or the location I mentioned a little bit earlier. This is the Corrigan's Island residence, and this is a real photo postcard near Morrisburg, Ontario. And you can see the photographer's name at the bottom. So I'm not sure if he produced this and it was sold commercially, or if he just took this photo and produced it for the family. But this card was sent to her half-sister Vida in 1917 or 1918. She wrote about Vida on the postcard I showed earlier, and here's her writing directly to Vida. And she says she's having a fine time and gaining in weight. We start to Quebec and up the Rideau on a private yachting cruise for a week tomorrow. Love, Laura. And I picked this, the back of this to show, just because, again, I think it's a really neat example of how the wealthy lived at that time. She's at their island home in Ontario, and they're about to go on a private yachting cruise. So just really phenomenal and really cool. This is her husband, James. He was also known as Jimmy and even called Playboy Jimmy. And in many ways, he had a more tragic life than Laura. James's sisters and mother, along with a cousin and niece, passed away when their yacht capsized on July 7th of 1900. Here's a postcard of the yacht that they would have used at their vacation home in Ontario. It's named Ida May after James's sister who died at age 15 in the accident. And I was reading a newspaper article about the accident. The yacht encountered high winds on Lake Erie and trapped 3 people below deck. Ida May was actually above board, but unfortunately she wasn't able to stay afloat until rescuers arrived. And only one passenger survived, the wife of James Jr.'s Uncle John. But all of the crew survived. So back then, obviously, the crew is not as wealthy as the passengers on the yacht. And when all of the crew survive, you're going to have some questions that come up. And the captain of the boat was actually initially arrested and charged with manslaughter, but was later exonerated. And James Jr.'s father, James Sr., would pass away 8 years later in 1908 at the age of 59. Upon the death of his father, James received $15,000 in cash and 40% of Corgan McKinney steel stock to be held in trust until he reached age 40. So $15,000 probably seems a little bit low for a family that is this wealthy. And that's because Jimmy's problems started before his father had passed, and his father actually wasn't going to give him any inheritance at all, but it was his business partner, Price McKinney, that convinced James Sr. to leave Jimmy an inheritance. So the 40% of Corgan McKinney steel stock, like I said, he didn't actually receive it. It was held in trust until he reached age 40. And initially, this seems like a really selfless move from Price McKinney to convince his business partner to cut some slack to his son and actually leave him an inheritance, but he did have ulterior motives. So Price McKinney used that stock held in trust, dropped the name Corgan from the company in 1917, which obviously upset James very much. And after that, he entered a court battle to gain back control of his 40% in stock. And James purchased another 13% to gain total control of the company. So obviously you need 51% to control the company. And it was actually Laura that helped him get that 13% in stock. She convinced the grandchildren of another original partner to sell their 13%. And with Laura's savviness and with them winning their court battle, they were able to compile 53% of Corgan McKinney steel stock, and he was able to take control of the company. I thought this was really interesting because when Price McKinney had control of the company, he named it McKinney Steel. But when James Jr. regained control of the company, he didn't rename it Corrigan Steel. He kept the original name, Corgan McKinney Steel. But this hit Price McKinney very hard. So after he was relieved of his responsibilities as company president, he took his own life just a few months later. Like I said, Jimmy was known as a playboy, and he was commonly called Playboy Jimmy, and he partied and drank very heavily. When I researched his life, what I found out kind of made sense that he experienced a lot of tragedy very early in life. And that is a theme through both Laura's and James Jr.'s life, is they experienced family tragedy. And unfortunately, back then, we just didn't have the tools we do now to deal with mental illness and things like that. So people would unfortunately turn to things like substance abuse to cope with their problems. Jimmy did pass away early due to his drinking and his partying lifestyle. He would die in 1928 of a heart attack, and he was only 47 years old. After he passed away, Laura did not have any interest in running the company. I actually saw some really funny newspaper articles written at the time because nothing like this had ever happened, that a woman would potentially be running a huge company. And there were several articles written in newspapers that were up in arms that a woman would take control of this company. And it just, again, goes to show how the attitudes were so much different back then. But Laura didn't have any interest in running the company. She and the other owners of the company sold it, and Laura would receive a tax-free annuity of $800,000 per year, which was a pretty sweet deal. And that's what she would use to go on and move to England. And that's when she was rubbing shoulders with Winston Churchill, the Queen of England, and really just having a grand time living off that $800,000 annuity. I hope you enjoyed learning more about Laura's life. Since I have a little bit more time here at the end, I wanted to share a couple other postcards that are really notable because of the messages on the back. This image here was sent by a Miss Elizabeth Dean, but it's not the front of the postcard that's exciting. If you see this, if you saw this postcard in Wichita in 2 weeks, would you pick it up if you're a collector? Probably not, unless you're a collector of trees or hills. But it's not the real photo on the front that's exciting. It's the back. So you can even see on the front, she writes Deaconess Dean, Alaska. And she was a notable missionary, and this was the first image of my presentation. Without ever reading the back, I would have never known any of the family history here. But she writes, thank the auxiliary for the clothing sent to the hospital. A number of packages have been received and are very acceptable as well as useful. With kind regards. And she signs her name down there at the bottom. But she was a missionary in Alaska, and she came from a very prominent family in Hoboken, New Jersey, the Clinton family. And when I was researching her family, I believe she may even have ties to the Clintons that served in the Revolutionary War out of Hoboken, New Jersey. But she was actually sent to a missionary in Alaska around the time of the gold rush in 1897. And she would stay there for a while and only come back to the contiguous United States right before her death in 1913. And I have one more for you, and this is one of my favorite postcards in my collection. If you see the front here, this is a really uncommon card and one that's not really sought after by collectors. It's a phrase card, or whatever you call it, a quote. And this is one that you just really you don't see too much because there was no popularity. There was no demand for these types of cards. And the message says, while oft I caused you sorrow, nor so oft I fear brought you joy, I know you're always glad to get a message from your boy. And the picture at the top shows a woman who looks like she's upset or just pensively looking ahead. And I thought, when I saw the front, why would someone send a postcard like this? And the back, believe it or not, I thought maybe, you ran out of postcards, you need something to send, so you just grab this one. Maybe the store has them on sale, or buy one, get one free for a week or whatever. But the message on the back actually is completely related to the message on the front. So this postcard says on the back, it was sent November 16th, 1912 out of Houston, Texas. And the sender writes, Dear Mother and Father, this will inform you that I was married November 14th, 1912 at 11:30 a.m. and am now in my own little home once again. We would be pleased to receive a visit from you at any time. Your son and daughter, Rolla and Margaret. I was able to research Rolla B. Stebbins out of Kansas City, Missouri. He was married to a hometown girl in the early 1900s, but they would go on to get divorced, and he moved to Houston and later remarried. And I just thought this message was so interesting because it's clearly a man who is trying to reconnect with his family. They may not have talked for a very long time because he's writing that he's now married, and he's writing it as if his parents didn't even know that he was seeing anyone or didn't even know that he was engaged. And he is reaching out and trying to reconnect with his parents and trying to rekindle that relationship. And because of that, this postcard is very special to me, but it's one that I wouldn't have even noticed was so special unless I looked at the back. And if you're interested in the backs of postcards, I would invite you to check out ephemerasearch.com. For the Laura Corgan postcards I showed in this presentation, I tried to pick some of the most interesting postcards to show, but there are many more in her collection, and I actually uploaded them all to Ephemerasearch. So you can just go there and search for Laura Corrigan, and all of her postcards will come up. I have all the other postcards that I have ever collected or ever sold up on the website. But I believe there's now hundreds of thousands, and by the end of the year, they're trying to get to 1 million. So no matter if you just like reading the messages, if you just like looking up postcards, if you want to learn more about your family history, one thing that's really neat is you can search by name, location, date. You can really narrow it down, and maybe you'll find something actually sent to or from a family member. The founder of this website is AJ Bowen, and she's actually going to be in Wichita this year. So if you are also going to Wichita, make sure you say hi to her. She will be there with a scanner, and she will be trying to scan any postcards that come in her vicinity. So if you have a collection, or if you're a seller, or if you have any that you'd like to add to the website, I really can't believe she does this for free, but you can just give her your entire collection and she will scan them all for you, and she will upload them to the website for you. So it's basically just free digitization of your collection or of postcards that you're selling. Thank you so much for watching this presentation today, and thank you for Hal for having me, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you, Daniel. My gosh, what fun. And Amy, AJ Bowen will be here with that ephemera search. And like Daniel said, and so we look forward to seeing her again this year. Rayhan, do we have any questions that were posed?
We do indeed, Hal. First of all, I think I'll go to the last one on the list. You said something, or you mentioned Whistler's mother.
Yes.
Isn't that the painting?
Yes.
Would you like to elaborate on that?
I'm sorry, I don't know much more about it.
I do.
Good.
And
Yes. Let me make use of my old training in art history. Yeah, that's a very, very famous painting by James McNeill Whistler. It is a painting of his mother. And it was commonly reproduced in all different kinds of forms, prints and whatnot. I think it was painted in 1871, somewhere around in there. And the original is in Paris.
so this is the painting that is commonly referred to in the
Whistler's
art
mother.
world as Study in Grays.
Oh, yeah, that's another name for it, but commonly it's called Whistler's mother. It is actually the artist's mother who sat for the painting.
Okay, that clears that up.
It was on that postcard, with the sun riding back. So it was an appropriate image to have on that postcard.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Wow, yeah, I never knew that. That's really cool.
Okay. Mark asked if you stumbled across these randomly, or did you buy a collection?
Oh yeah, I saw that question in there a lot in the chat, which is funny because I actually had that in there at the end of my presentation, and I cut it out because I didn't think anyone would be interested in hearing that. But yeah, I'm happy to tell about how I acquired them. So I got these in 2021, and it was right after I discovered postcards and postcard collecting. And I was originally purchasing these to resell, but obviously did not resell them. But it was really early on, and it was one of the first postcards at all, or one of the first postcards in general that I had bought. And they came in a photo album. I asked the seller more information about them. I bought them on eBay. It was just like in a modern photo album, and she said that they were in an antique store that had closed down. The antique store, I believe, was in Ohio. So they were sitting in the antique store for years, and eventually that shop closed down, and this reseller bought them, and she listed them for sale on eBay. and it was only $35 for the entire album, and there were probably about 100 postcards in there. But I never listed a single one of them. I would just look at them and spend like hours just looking at the fronts of them, and it was actually weeks or months before I even thought to turn over the back and look at it, because I didn't know what I had, because I thought all postcards were just like that. And when I began getting more postcards, I was like, well, none of these are of people's houses. This is weird. These aren't like monuments or anything. This isn't like the White House. So I thought there might be something special. And eventually I read all the backs and noticed that they were all written by the same person and sent to the same person. And I'm very glad that I was able to purchase it and keep it together, and that it didn't get broken up.
Well, I'm
Daniel,
glad
do you,
you did that.
do you think you could put your email address into the chat window? The reason why I'm saying is several of us have procured collections, in fact, from antique stores, looked on the back, done research about who sent them or who they were sent to, looked on ancestry.com, figured out who the people were, and reconstructed their lives. I myself have done some analyses similar to what you've done, and I think I'd like to share them back and forth. So I see you've already put it, your email address, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, I'd love to hear about, ever since I got this first one, I just love complete collections that are together that you can like reconstruct a family history from. And I think those are super cool.
I completely agree with you. The backside is sometimes more interesting than the front side.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like
Thank
to
you.
chime in and agree with that. I'd like to join Daniel in suggesting that we all read the backs of postcards. Postcard History over the years has published quite a number of articles, a few by our good friend Shav Levine, who has read messages on the backs of cards and created an entire story about them. And I see Clarissa's got her hand up. Let's hear from you, please.
Yeah, I had the same experience than you, Daniel. One day, but it was 20 years ago, I bought 500 postcards because I looked on the back and they were from the same people. So I bought the whole box as opposed to buying only the nice one. And I did write an article for Postcard History some time ago about them, two lovers in Italy during World War One.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
And then Paul recently helped me find more about the story about her. Can't find anything about him, but
Shav, can you tell us about your experience with backs of postcards?
Oh, no, I appreciate you mentioning that, Ray. No, that's the first thing I do is read the back of postcards, and it's amazing what you can find out on them. I enjoyed that talk very much, Dan. Anyway, it's a lot of fun to read the back, and you can find all kinds of neat stories on them if you look.
And one final thing from the chat room, how you ask about who was Prince George,
Right.
and I think it was Mark replied to you that Prince George was the same gentleman who became King George V.
Oh, okay.
Do I have that right? Was that Mark? Who?
I didn't reply, but that's correct. I agree. It's George V.
Okay.
1910 to 1936.
You can look on YouTube and I did a Zoom a few months ago on a collection that I bought that was all one family's, and it was the man's trip from Conshohocken, Pennsylvania to White River, South Dakota to claim land. And it was the backs of the cards that were the most fascinating. And he told the story of his trip. And if you haven't seen it, look on the Wichita Postcard Club YouTube and you can find it. It's called Go West, Young Man.
Yeah, I think I have seen that one. That
Yeah.
one's really good. Yeah, if anybody hasn't seen it, they should definitely watch it.
That's wonderful. Just think what we've done in these last several months. Daniel, any other questions? Then I'll say something to Daniel.
I don't think
Great.
we have any other questions.
Okay, I wanted to mention that he's not tooting his own horn like he needs to, but it was Ashley who told me about Daniel's videos that he's been making. I think he posts them once a week. It's almost like postcard history. But anyway, please tell us about that, Daniel, and where we can find it.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, Alan dropped a link in the chat to my YouTube channel, but on that, it's a little something for everybody. I have playlists created, so you can I have a postcard history playlist where I have a video about Laura Corgan, and I have a lot of other cool postcards that I've come across that I make videos about and talk about the history behind them. If you ever want to learn more about reselling postcards, I have a lot of videos about that, but I've just used it over the past few months as a way to create a little community out there and get people more interested in postcard selling and postcard collecting. I actually had somebody, I just thought of this because of the topic, but somebody messaged me a postcard they had found the other day, and it was a completely boring postcard, one that you would find in like a nickel box if there is such a thing, but it was like a greeting card. But because they watched my videos, they started to pay attention to the messages on the back, and the sender was writing that the largest passenger ship in history just sunk yesterday. So they're actually writing about the Titanic. And if you would have never looked at the back, we would have completely missed it. But it was really interesting to see a look into their mind and how they talked about it, because they said it's the only thing on the front page. You have to check out the newspaper, and they didn't even mention Titanic once. They just said the largest passenger ship. So I thought that was a really cool find by someone.
Oh, that's a real slice of history. Any other questions or comments?
I'll make a comment, and I'm happy to take credit for Daniel being with us and being a part of our group. Daniel, I watch all your videos. You do a great job. I love the variety. And what makes me really happy about Daniel, and I hope he's inspiring other people, is that, you know, he's talking about reselling, which a lot of people like to do, but also with that, as he said, he's telling the history of people he finds out about, or their history of cards, to bring that realm into it too, so that I hope that inspires, you know, his generation. I'm older than he is, and some of you have been collecting for many decades too. I just really want this postcard hobby to continue, and Daniel, I think you're doing a good job of helping maybe plant that seed in your viewers, and I think that's really important. So thanks for what you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I look at the selling aspect, you're talking about that as like the bait that you put on the hook to catch the fish, and that gets people interested. Because when I see there's so many younger people that are interested in things like baseball cards and sports cards, and I just think that postcards are a lot better for so many reasons. There's so much variety, they're cheaper, and it's such a great hobby that, yeah, hopefully I can continue to get a lot of people interested.
Good, good. Ann Ross is here today from California, and she's the lady that is so associated in recent months with signed artist postcards. She's just been showing killer cards, talking about artists, and it's nice to see Ann Ross here. Thank you for coming, Ann. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just had a really brief story to add to the everybody's mentions of art, the backs of postcards. This isn't I didn't find a whole bunch of them, but I did a year or two ago at the Arcadia show. I bought a postcard of an Easter card, you know, printed in Germany, of Easter hares, because I like Easter hares. And I brought it home and I turned it over the back, and it said, Master Jack. It was addressed to Master Jack Berryman, Utah Avenue in Baltimore. And I used to live in Maryland, so I knew Utah Avenue in Baltimore was a very posh area. So I looked the Master Jack up, and it turns out when Master Jack Berryman, he was the son of Cliff Berryman, who was the cartoonist that developed the cartoon that resulted in teddy bears being manufactured. And Cliff Berryman was a Pulitzer Prize winning caricaturist and cartoonist. And Jack, who the postcard was addressed to by his aunt, Jack, when he grew up, he also won a Pulitzer Prize for editorial cartooning.
Oh, isn't that great? Wonderful.
Yes, it was wonderful. And I, had wished that I had gone back to the dealer and said, do you have any more that looked like this on the back?
Oh,
I
wow.
didn't do it.
Yeah. I know some years ago, there was, if you go back 45 years and thinks what's happened and the dealers we've had at the show and the collectors and I can remember there was a slice of time when Sally Carver was, she was a big postcard dealer. Sally Carver was the author of the Tuck book. And for 100 years, there was no books on
Right.
postcards at all. And her Tuck book was one of the first. Why people just stood up, why Tuck? It's a Tuck. It's from England. And it was hilarious to see all of that. And then to realize later how many zillions of Tuck cards there are and artists and so forth and so forth. But really been fun and, good to see. There was one thing I wanted to say when I forgot it. I threw in Sally Carver instead, but I know it was. There was a slice of time when people were looking for goat carts in Europe, and a little cart pulled by a goat, and that was a big thing. We've seen the ups and downs and changes in interest. When I started back in the old days, when I started collecting, no one wanted black and white cards or real photo. Those were under the table. They weren't out on the top of the table under glass like they are today. We change, we learn, and that's part of the real thrill for me in postcard collecting, seeing the changes through the years. And when's the last time people talked about clapsaddle very much? But Anne has been just tweaking those interesting stories, and the artists that she's been talking about has really been fun. Thank you, Anne. I hope you'll come back to more of these.
Yes, I will.
Good. And be a speaker too. We'd love that.
Well, I have more. I have more stories.
Good. Okay. Well, I guess that kind of sums it up.